Welcome to Kensington Palace. For over 300 years, this building has been a glittering stage for the British monarchy. It is a place of public lives, but also of secret stories. We usually come here to walk in the footsteps of the kings and queens, the grand monarchs, and their powerful advisors. But today, we aren't looking at the people sitting on the thrones. We are looking at the people standing in the shadows. Historic royal palaces has lifted the veil on the Georgian era to reveal the untold lives of the court, from seamstresses to rat catchers, wet nurses to Turkish valets. An army of people lived and worked here. They were the ones who kept the royal machinery running. Today, we are going beyond the staterooms to find out what life was really like for the thousands of people who called this palace home. The four Georges. To understand the servants, we first have to understand their masters. In 1714, the British monarchy underwent a seismic change. The crown passed to the House of Hanover, and George I arrived from Germany to take the throne. He was selected ahead of around 50 other relatives who had stronger blood claims but were Roman Catholic. George was Protestant, and that was what mattered. We often remember the Georgian kings by lazy stereotypes. There was George I, the German who refused to learn English. George II, the military man, the last king to lead an army into battle. George III, the so-called farmer king who wrestled with madness. And George IV, the interior design-obsessed playboy who convinced himself he fought at Waterloo. While there is truth to these caricatures, they obscure a sophisticated reality. This was a time of profound industrial and imperial transformation. And ironically, it was this German family that helped define Britishness itself. The grand staircase, to see the faces of the people who actually ran this palace. You have to go to the King's Grand Staircase. Painted by William Kent in the 1720s, this mural is unique. It doesn't show gods, goddesses, or mythical heroes. It shows real people. As you climbed these stairs 300 years ago to meet the king, you were being watched by the painted faces of his staff. It was almost confrontational a way for George's German courtiers to stare down the English aristocracy who resented them. Look closely at the faces. On the left, you see a doctor named John Arbuthnot. Standing next to him is a young boy named Peter. At the time, he was known as Peter the Wild Boy. He had been discovered living feral in the woods near Hanover. He was brought to court as a curiosity, a pet of sorts. Dr. Arbuthnot was charged with teaching Peter to speak, a task he never accomplished. Higher up, we see the musicians. Among them is a trumpeter believed to be John Cato. His presence confirms a long history of black trumpeters at the English court, dating back to the Tudors. It reminds us that Georgian London was far more diverse and cosmopolitan than we often imagine. The Turkish valets, perhaps the most controversial figures at court, were King George I's closest servants, Mustafa and Mete. These two men were Turkish valets, originally taken as prisoners of war in Ottoman Greece. They were brought to Hanover, converted to Christianity, and eventually followed George to England. Mepet was even ennobled by the Holy Roman Emperor and served as the keeper of the royal purse. In the painting, Mehmet wears a Polish fur hat with Eastern undergarments, a composite identity. But outside the palace walls, they were treated with deep suspicion. The English press viewed them as infidels and resented their intimacy with the king. And that intimacy was literal. Mehmet's duties included medically examining the king's hemorrhoids, or piles, as they were known. He knew the king's body and his secrets better than anyone. For the English aristocracy, having to foreign men in such a powerful position was a scandal. The machinery, bells, and jobs leave the painted staircase, and you enter the below-stairs world. This was a labyrinth of narrow corridors that up to 1,000 servants navigated daily. Before modern technology, the palace ran on the bell system. Before these bells were wired through the walls, a king had to ring a handbell, and a footman had to wait just outside the door. The wired bell changed everything. It allowed servants to be invisible until summoned. Different bells had different pitches, telling the staff exactly which room needed food, wine, or a fire lit. The staff list was endless and bizarre. The payroll included a keeper of the lions, a monitor care, a rat catcher, and even a keeper of ice and snow. We actually have the saw used by the keeper of ice. His job was to cut ice from frozen canals and store it in underground wells. This allowed the Georgians to enjoy the height of luxury, chilled champagne and ice cream. Right here in the 1700s. Fashion and hierarchy upstairs, the pressure to impress was immense. We see it in the fashion. This is a mantua, a dress with a bizarrely wide shape held out by whalebone panniers. The maids of honor, whose job was to keep the court entertained, had to wear these. They couldn't sit down properly. They had to glide sideways through doors. They were essentially beautiful women on wheels. But for every silk dress, there was a linen apron. This humble garment belonged to Mrs. Thielke, the dresser to Queen Charlotte. While the apron looked simple, Mrs. Thielke was a powerful woman. Diaries from the time tell us the Queen would start dressing at 1:45. Mrs. Thielke would spend hours with her, handing her garments in the correct order while the Queen read the newspaper aloud to her. In a world of rigid hierarchy, this apron represents a rare, intimate friendship across class lines. The royal kitchens, of course, the heart of the palace was the kitchen. Georgian banquets were served à la francaise, meaning all dishes for a course. Sometimes up to 70 plates arrived at once. We are lucky to have a surviving notebook from William Daniel, the master cook to George II in 1736. It gives us a rare glimpse into the royal diet. The menu was a mix of the familiar and the strange. On Christmas Day, 1736, the king ate plum broth and turkey. But the notebook also lists macaroni, a foreign novelty at the time, and German dishes the king taught the English chefs to cook. Then there were the status symbols. The notebook lists potted turtle, a supreme delicacy, and right next to it, puffins. Yes, the king was eating seabirds. The book also notes which dishes were served on silver and which on china. Eating off fine porcelain was a new luxury, reserved for the most delicate foods. Diplomacy and dynasty, the palace wasn't just a home. It was a diplomatic engine. In 1734, the Presence Chamber hosted a delegation of Cherokee Indians from the newly established colony of Georgia. Their leader, Tomatichi, presented King George with eagle feathers as a symbol of peace, a striking moment where the old world met the new within these walls. But ultimately, the most important job in the palace was securing the bloodline. In 1818, the royal family faced a crisis. Plenty of children, but no legitimate heirs. The race was on. It ended in this room in 1819 with the birth of the future Queen Victoria. Raising these heirs fell to women like Catherine Elliot, a royal wet nurse. It was a job that required sacrificing her own family life, but it paid a fortune, £500 a year, followed by a lifelong pension. A reminder that in the Georgian court, your body could be your business. Conclusion: when we look at the aprons, the kitchen notebooks, and the faces in the murals, the palace changes. It stops being just a monument to kings and queens. It becomes a workplace, a home to thousands of people, black trumpeters, German cooks, Turkish valets, and English seamstresses, who lived, loved, and worked in the shadow of the crown. These are the untold lives of Kensington Palace.